I'm Robert Head, president of Rockford University, and it's indeed my privilege to welcome you to our campus. And thanks so much for attending the Transform Rockford second community learning event. As a member of Transform's steering committee, I'm joined by many of my colleagues at Rockford University as participants in this great effort. We truly are looking forward to the great results that I know that it will produce. It's unique, it's energizing, and I know the results will be quite successful. For over 167 years, Rockford University has served this community in roles such as education, societal needs, culture, and many, many more. And we'll continue to do that good work as the strategies of this particular effort come to fruition. This university has great assets educationally in Rockford University, Rock Valley College, Northern Illinois University, and the Medical College, from which to leverage strategies that might be coming forth regarding education. And I want to thank you for your time, your interest, and your engagement in helping this great transformation project move forward. At this time, I'd like to introduce Sharon Cooper, a professor in business at Rock Valley College. Sharon chaired the business program for 7 years and is now actively engaged in the accreditation and assessment of student learning processes on campus. Prior to joining Rock Valley College, Sharon worked in the manufacturing industry as an engineer and in operations management. She currently serves as board chair for Winnebago County's court-appointed special advocates and is actively engaged in the Transform Rockford initiative as a part of the analyses and process teams. So at this time, please welcome Sharon Cooper.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and to have been asked to introduce our guest speaker and our panel. One of the reasons I believe I stand before you is because a few people in the room have identified that I am a process geek. I'm passionate about process, and yes, the notion of dream big goals, identifying the strategic plan and the most effective and efficient way to accomplish those goals, and to measure them and make sure that we're following a continuous improvement plan and making sure we have quality all the while, is something that keeps me up at night. I know, it's sad, but it's true. Okay. When I attended the kickoff meeting last November with many of you, many of the speakers resonated with me and my passion for process. I listened to Tom Gendron speak about the success of the process at Woodward and how it had transformed their business, and about the potential that that type of process could also transform our community. Later that same evening, Scott Anderson and Angel Contreras from the process team articulated a logical process that has been proven to support change in many places and likely could also work to transform our community. I was encouraged that there was a potential plan that could make a difference. But I became a believer when Pastor Ken Board conveyed the need to trust the process that involved a three-legged stool approach consisting of commitment and hard work, accountability, and lastly, but I would argue most importantly, integrity. Anything that's worth doing involves a need to trust a good process and execute it with persistence and patience, as Lorraine Logan pointed out to us that night. If you think about it, anything that we do, parenting is a process. There is no silver bullet for parenting, is there? There's starts and stops and continuing, whether it be a business that we're trying to get off the ground and get going, a not-for-profit, things that are going on in the faith community, they all involve process. We have a tremendous opportunity tonight to learn from Dr. Norman Walser. Dr. Walser earned a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois in Urbana and is currently senior research scholar in the Center for Governmental Studies at NIU, where he conducts research on local and regional economic development practices, as well as innovative entrepreneurship practices. As part of these efforts, he regularly works with state and local governments on issues related to strategic planning and local development issues as part of NIU's outreach and regional development. In this capacity, He worked with RADAC on the most recent Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, CEDS, and related economic diversification project. Dr. Walser is widely published, and as a matter of fact, his book, Community Visioning Practices, was being read by Tom Gendron, by Mike Shablowski, and by Scott and Angel when they started talking about this process. And it took them a little bit of time to realize that the author of this book lived down the road. And in fact, was in the audience the night that we began this process at the Coronado Theater. So we're very fortunate to have him with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Walser and our panel to tonight's event. Can I also mention to you that when the panel is done, or when Dr. Walser's presentation is done and we've done the panel discussion, we'll open it up for questions, and then we'll have time for Mike to come up and tell us what's next. Thank you.
It's always nice when the computer works. I'm very pleased to be here tonight. This is I was raised actually by my daughter, so this is a long time ago, and traveled a fair amount, but was in Macomb for about 35 years at Western Illinois University, and then about 6 years ago came back to DeKalb to work at Northern. So in a sense, I'm kind of coming home. So I've really known Rockford for the better part of 60-some years. So it's a pleasure to be here. It's also a pleasure because I think what you're really doing now, and I say this really modestly, not to be patronizing at all, but I think that in 10 years from now, you're probably going to be seen as somebody or some group that has really made a major difference. And if you look at it, and we've studied these things from afar, but I don't know of any city now that has embarked on this kind of a 10-year transformation, or where the picture was that long. A lot of times people look at 2, 3 years, 5 years, something like this. But to talk about actually making a community different in a positive sort of way, and to do it consciously, not just we hope it's going to happen, and to do it the right way, I think it's really, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But I think you'll be able to be proud in a few years that you were part of it. So I just hope that happens. What I have here tonight is a little bit of background on some work we did over the last few years. As Sharon indicated, I've worked with local communities and state and regional governments for quite a while. But several years ago, we recognized, a group of us, probably 10 or 12 across the country, that were doing this kind of work. We realized that we really didn't have much knowledge about what kind of makes these things work. Not so much the specific technique was used, but what were the basic principles that when you looked at the outcomes really had made a difference. So rather than going and getting a grant, which I like to do, but rather than getting a grant and looking at 100 cities or 200 cities and trying to study them in detail, what we did was we pulled together a group of about 12 people who in essence had worked with community visioning programs for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. So collectively, this group of people probably had worked and managed programs for maybe 1,000 cities or better. So essentially, we pulled them together for a couple of years and started asking what mattered, what made a difference, looking back on the communities that you've worked with, what really was the telling factor. And so I don't come to you with 101 best practices, but what I come to you with is the collective wisdom of people who had in fact worked with these communities, managing programs in literally probably 1,200 communities. So that's kind of what we're going to do tonight. I wanted to start out with just a couple of short things here. The idea of, we're going to talk about some megatrends and some things that I think whatever kind of environment you're working with is going to be important to think about. So let's spend a little bit of time on that. Then I want to talk a little bit about some development perspectives. And I'd like you to think a little bit about where does Transform Rockford fit in terms of the economic development routine, in terms of business recruiting. Where does it fit in the whole big picture? And I think you might be kind of surprised how this all comes together. The third thing that I'd like to talk about is some common factors that seem to have contributed to community change across the country. So most of programs I'm going to talk about are in fact in the Midwest, but we actually had some experiences overseas. Then I'd like to narrow down a little bit and talk about some work that the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago is doing with cities that had a high percentage of manufacturing in the 60s, went way down, but now have come back. And they've taken 10 or 12 cities and they've kind of studied those in detail, trying to figure out what sort of things do they have in common. And I think there are some things Rockford could learn. As a matter of fact, I think there's a possibility that maybe in the next round that Rockford could be considered in that kind of a study. At least, we've talked about it. And then I'd like to go a little farther and talk about, now that you're through the visioning, which is not only the most fun part, probably in some respects the easiest part to manage, but now you're on really the critical part, namely how do you implement a strategy? How do you form it? How do you implement it? How do you make it go? These kinds of things. So I don't discourage you at all, because I think that will be the most fun part for a lot of you, because it really gets down to where the tire hits the road and what you're actually going to say, I wonder if this would work. Why don't we try it? And you're able to do that. You have the luxury to do it, because things are going to come and go. But if you're in it for the 10-year horizon, it's worth doing. And then finally, let's just talk about some specific implementation strategies. So, some major trends. I don't really call these so much mega trends. I just think that these are trends that we have to deal with. And the first thing is that we have a pretty significant group of baby boomers who, in essence, are going to retire. And they're close to retirement, but anyhow, they're going to keep getting older. So essentially, we've got to deal with that. That's going to be a bigger part of our America. So when we talk about Rockford area in 10 years from now, we're really talking about a different population age structure, and other things. So it's something I think you need to recognize. The second thing is, everywhere the growth seems to be, the employment growth seems to be more in services. Now, manufacturing is booming. There's no question about it. Value added is up, GNP is up, these kinds of things. So all the manufacturing jobs haven't gone overseas. I mean, that's a myth. But the manufacturing is so productive now that we have bigger machines, higher technology, so one person produces more. The reverse of that is we don't need as many people anymore. So manufacturing employment may very well drift down, but manufacturing as a contributor to the economy is going to probably keep going up. So that's something I think you have to think about. The third thing is increase in urbanization. The millennials, the younger generations want to live in cities. They want to live in downtowns. This is a phenomenon that, at least for a while, perhaps until they get kids or whatever, but for a while, we're going to deal with it. So you see a lot of change, regentrification in downtown Chicago is the closest example. But there are opportunities. As you think about young adults coming in, you may want to think about what should Rockford have in terms of housing. Do they want to be downtown? Do they want to be where, or at least someplace where there's a lot of folks getting together at nights and having a good time? So that's something that a transformed Rockford probably needs to take into consideration, all right? The next thing is, even though natural gas is doing well now, and Illinois is probably going to benefit from that, the price of energy is probably going to go up, as it turns out. So we need to somehow figure out how would that affect cities, the way cities are laid out, whatever. So these are the kind of some issues I think that are going to be important. And then finally, there's no denying the importance of global trade, globalization in general, whether it's travel, whether it's marketing, whatever. You're very fortunate here. Our AEDC is doing a lot of work on global, so you're ahead of the game, ahead of a lot of communities. So you've got a couple of advantages in Rockford that I think you're going to want to consider. You're only 90 miles or so from probably the third or fourth best connected city in the world, namely Chicago. So you have access to Chicago. You have, I've forgotten how many exactly, but so I won't say a number, but there are a bunch of consulates in Chicago. So if you have business leaders that want to make connections overseas, 90 miles away, they would probably drive out and talk. So this is a kind of setting, the kind of mega trend that I think when you talk about Transform Rockford, you need to talk about. These are basically major assets that you can take advantage of. Let's talk just a little bit about population trends. Now, you first look at this and you say, oh my gosh, it's not something to be afraid of at all. This is a fact. This is population projections to 2025. And we're talking about a large increase in the proportion of people that are 65 years old and over. The group behind them, the group that we call the Generation X, are a good deal smaller. So when you look at 2025, that generation is going to represent a much smaller portion of the total population than the baby boomers did in their time, all right? Now, reason that I think that's important is because the large population, a large segment of it, for at least 10 years or so, is going to be older people. So what do they like? Do they like mowing grass? Do they like shoveling snow? Probably not. So do you have the kind of facilities that they want to do? I have two sons, close to 40 years old. Neither one of them likes to mow grass. So I'm not sure that the millennial generation is going to necessarily want to live in the same sort of thing that I did as a baby boomer. But these are the kind of things that as you think 10 years ahead, you start to look at divisions, you start to look at the kind of programs that you could do. But again, I don't think that the population trends are negative. It's just you have to think about them, and you have to start factoring them into your strategies and whatever. And this is Boone and Winnebago counties, but you can go certainly farther than that. But I've run these numbers for Wisconsin on different projects, and I've run them for Iowa, and they're all about the same. We're all facing the same kind of questions. Rural areas are probably in worse shape, really, than you have here. Let's talk then a little bit about where a program like Transform Rockford really fits into the whole scheme of things. We read a lot in the paper about people trying to attract businesses. They're trying to get industry. We're doing whatever we can to create jobs. So where does Transform Rockford? Is it an economic development program? What kind of a program really is it? And I would submit that if you look at this kind of a scenario, you really have a nested set of developments. And the first one, the most narrow one, is probably industrial development. I mean, it's important, it employs a lot of people, but as far as scope, it's probably one of the smaller parts. Broader than industrial development, you have business development. So you're looking at downtowns, you're looking at support services, these kinds of activities. You go even beyond that, you get into economic development, and you may be thinking about the ability to provide services outside the region, the climate, the tax incentives, all these kinds of things as sort of an economic development arena. But the one that has to be there for all of these things to work successfully is community development. Now, community development is really what Transform Rockford is all about. You're really building a sense of community, and you're making a system that works, that works well, and that will enable the other three types of development to happen. And if you don't have that, you can still attract an industry. But having been in the economic development business for a long time, when you go to a community, or when a business person comes to a community, they ask about the industrial park. But the second thing they ask about, is there a hospital? What do your schools look like? That's really community development. So think about it. So what you're doing is really cutting edge, and it's going to have impacts on all the other folks that may be cutting ribbons and getting other kind of applause. But basically, you're at the heart of doing it. So it's really important. Now, when you think about community development, there's a program or an activity that's gained some attention really the last 15 years. It's called community capitals. And it's the idea that all these elements in a city are really like capital. You can spend them, you can build them, you can not take care of them, and they go away. So it's not all that much different than physical capital. So I just want to very quickly run through this. But the capitals that you're thinking about and people are looking at, and several of the cities that we can talk about, actually are building their visioning program stuff around the community capitals. So these things are pretty legitimate. There's some good science behind them, a lot of research. So you're talking about financial capital. Can you get loans? Can people get financing for the houses? Can they do these kind of things? Do you have political capital? Are you able to manage the city? Do your leaders participate? Are they well informed? Are they doing a good job? Social capital. Do we get along? Can we make deals? Can we basically just make good decisions that are useful for the community? And in essence, what you're doing with Transform Rockford is building that social capital. You're building several capitals, but you're certainly building the social capital by people getting together and discuss the kind of things that they want and how they can develop a shared vision. So a shared vision is really important on something like social capital. And you have human capital. These are the people. And the human capital is what you're trying to do is educate more people. You're trying to get the people stay in school. You're trying to get them to have certifications or the kind of jobs that are essential to earn high incomes. Cultural capital. Cultural capital is really the blending of a lot of different backgrounds, nationalities, other kind of experiences. And these are really the approaches that we take to activities. So if an issue comes up, different kinds of cultures, different kinds of groups are going to approach it differently. So if we can have an effective cultural capital in a location, we're more likely to have more community development. And Transform Rockford is addressing cultural capital. You're pulling people together from different cultures, different backgrounds. They're working together. This is essentially building cultural capital. And this is going to be terribly important. Natural capital is so your resources. You have a river running through Rockford. You might think about it, could you develop it better? Could you make it a pathway? And this has been discussed, but could you make it a pathway? Could you make it an exciting time for people to come and live into downtown and be close to the river? Something like that. I ran across in Iowa a small community that actually had a river running through town. They re-engineered it somehow. They now have a rapids running through their downtown. Literally, it's a small town, and you can actually go down to rapids through this small town. Great attraction for people coming to the area. Little ingenuity, taking natural capital and building it. So that's what they did. The build capital is your roads, your streets, your bridges, your buildings, whatever. But it's the kind of things that we collectively, as a city, build. Now, all of those things, all the capitals, if they come together in the right way, can generate a vital economy, they can generate a social inclusion setting, and they get a healthy ecosystem. That, in my opinion, is what your game or your outcome is for Transform Rockford. You're really working on those things. Now, you're working on it on a million small pieces, but at the end of the day, when the puzzle comes together, you have really built this capital. You've really built this kind of cultural capital. And I think that's going to be the real value that you're going to look back on and see. Things are done differently in 10 years. Things are better in 10 years. People are going to want to come here in 10 years. Not that they don't necessarily now, but the point would be it's going to be a positive experience. But this is, in a sense, trying to help you understand what it is you're doing, even though on a day-to-day basis, you might not see all these pieces. Okay, so we pulled together these communities as our leaders, actually, as we talked earlier. The idea of how do we figure out if you had a bunch of community change networks. Now, by community change, what we're talking about is bringing about new things or different attitudes, whatever, in a community. So we're not talking anything negative, but we're talking usually about, most always, about changing something for the positive. I was in Europe a while back, and you did a presentation on community change, and it has a very different impression there. It has an impression of somehow somebody from the outside trying to somehow modify externally the community. I think what we're going to talk about tonight and what you are doing is an open process, a positive process, but the ultimate effect is you're trying to direct some community change in the area. Now, even if you stayed home, community is going to change, but chances are it's not going to change for the better, all right? Hopefully what you're doing is the difference between a community that would have changed anyhow versus a community that's going to change in a positive sense. And that's really, I think, what makes it worth doing what you're doing. So what we tried to do with this group, and we've been with them now for about 3 years, and I helped organize the group initially, mainly because we just didn't think we understood some of the things that we were doing when I was with the Institute at Community Vision. It's just we worked with a lot of cities, we did some programs, things seemed to go well, but we were never really sure why it worked. So you can look at the slide here. But essentially, what we were trying to do with the network was to identify innovative practices, figure out some measures of output and practices that were being used by the cities, what did they value, find some commonalities that seemed related to successes, try to figure out could we transfer some of this knowledge to other places, and could Rockford learn from Valparaiso, or could it learn from Des Moines or something like that. Can we help design some new initiatives for practitioners? And do we learn some of the things that seem to consistently work? And I'm not a believer in just replicating, because I think that what is different or what happened in Des Moines is not necessarily going to happen in Rockford because they're so different. All right, and so you have to tailor, you have to come up with your own ideas. So I'm not just a transfer or transplant kind of person, but I do think you can learn about things that are common, and you can then bring them along, adapt them, and implement them, and make them work. And then finally, we wanted to encourage some research on community issues. We just wanted to get more people thinking about this stuff so that there would be a legacy, a science would be growing. And there's been quite a few articles published, and I've got a couple of books and various things. So there is a growing literature on these kinds of issues. And then finally, we wanted to foster some collaboration among various institutions. And it's kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit about community coaches at the end, but the Community Development Society in July is meeting in Dubuque. And it's a national organization. Probably 30 or 40% of the curriculum or of the presentations will be related to community change. So it's a growing feeling, it's really gathering a lot of attention. Okay, so what were the desired outcomes by our group? One is we wanted to find programs where the cities were reliant and independent. They had to be willing to interact in their environment. We wanted to build on and increase the strengths that they had going. We wanted to anticipate some changing trends and what the impacts would be, like I started with the megatrends. I think this is really an important thing to look at. Another thing that sometimes gets under the radar, we're on the verge of probably the biggest wealth transfer ever. And the baby boom population in many cases are fairly wealthy. We have farms, for example, that were in the family for 100 years. Now the kids have gone to Florida, Texas, wherever. The farm, when the person dies that owns it now, the farm will be dissipated. It'll go to some other farmer. But the wealth that was accumulated in this rural area particularly is probably not going to stay. This is true of businesses. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of wealth. I think it was about 3 years ago, one of the foundation groups in the Chicago area commissioned a study, and I'm probably wrong on the numbers here, but between something like 2010 and 2015, I know 2015, there was something like $23 billion in Illinois that is going to change hands because of this kind of a transfer. So if you're in Transform Rockford, you got to be asking, if we have some older people in the community, how do we involve them? How do they leave a legacy? What do we do to help them help the cause? So transfer of wealth is really important. You have to train the next generation. One of the difficulties that we saw in some of the programs that we looked at was that you had some people starting out the community change program. They worked with it for 5 years, whatever it was. They got another job somewhere else, or something else happened. There was no legacy. So you have to build that new generation. It's a little tougher these days because you have two wage earners in a family. They don't have time to volunteer as much as they did. So you have a lot of challenges to sort of get that next group of leadership to come up. But it is essential. And you need to think about that. And then finally, what we were trying to accomplish in this kind of program is we wanted sustainable policies. The kinds of things that will last after the first group is gone, after they have moved on. This is endemic to the community. The community is just a different Rockford, and it just moves ahead. And one of the problems we had when I worked with the Mapping the Future program in the Institute, it was a community visioning program. It was a good problem, but 5 years later, nobody remembered that we had been there. But the community was doing great. And so things were, going along fine. It's just they couldn't remember who it was that got this thing started. It's a little tough to explain to your president, but it's great to see that it happens. And this hopefully will happen to Transform Rockford as well. 10 years from now, people won't remember there was a Transform Rockford, but there's going to be a lot of people who want to come and live here and move ahead. And that's the goal, I would submit. That's your goal. Okay. So what did we find in these various programs? It really fell into 4 or 5 different strategies. One is that you need to prepare the community. The community has to be ready to go through a program. And I'll just make some side comments now as I go through. but I'm very impressed with the vision aspect of it that you're doing. I mean, this is really right on, because you're involving a lot of people, you're having sort of their say, they are shaping the program, so this community is going to be prepared for the next phase. And I think that's probably one of the more important things that you can do. So you can have a lot of strategies. Some are going to work, some aren't as well. But it's the idea of having the community ready for something like this to occur. So I think that's, you can be congratulated on that. The second one that we found that was common to these programs, and these are based on the program leaders, was that you really have a high-quality program. It can't be just something that, well, this seemed like a good idea, or why don't we try this? But it's really a thought-through, structured program. And you've also got that in Transform Rockford. There's been a lot of thought in. It made sense. It's been communicated. It can be challenged. You can modify it. So essentially, I think it's, you're on the right track there. You have to have an integrated and flexible system. That's probably you have to wait and see, because that'll be part of the strategy section. There's no reason to think it isn't going to happen, but kind of keep it in your mind as you move into the strategy phase, as you start trying things and doing things. Are they integrated? Are they flexible? Can you manage them? These kinds of things. And it'll become more complicated. As I said, probably the easier part is to get the people together and ask them what they'd like in Rockford. The harder part is going to be how we're going to get there. And what I do, does that conflict with what you do? And that's what you can't have. So in essence, we need to have this integrated program, and it needs to be flexible. I think among the program leaders that we talked with, one of the more important things was the persistent follow-up. Namely, when you do something with a strategy or whatever, you have to get back to the people. So you collected a lot of information now in visions. So presumably there's a process to where you're going back to the people. I know that you're putting it onto your website, all these kinds of things, and this is great for communication. But in essence, somehow they have to come back again. So they told you what they wanted. Now somehow they have to see that in fact they're getting what they asked for, or getting something like that. So I think that's an important thing that you have to keep in mind. And then finally, I think you have to, in a fairly scientific or in a business management way, you have to monitor your outcomes and you have to measure your results. And you have to do that, and Bert Barling, the last presentation, talked a little bit about that. And I don't think and I agree with him, I don't think it's so much that we're in the top 10 or something like that, but I think you monitor metrics that, number one, the Transform Rockford can affect. So if you're going to work on enrollment in schools, then you want to have a metric that finds out either how many students graduate or what happened as a result. And so I think these are the kind of things that are going to be important. Now, the good news from 30 miles away or wherever I live, the good news is you've got leadership. Woodward Governor is a strong business. It's got a business sense. Mike's got a business sense. Various of the people in the program are trained in the business area. So it's likely to have that kind of a mentality. We're likely to say, hey, couldn't we measure that? Hey, so we measured that, it didn't work. Shouldn't we be doing something about it? And I think that's really the important point. I came from a business background. I was dean of a college of business and chairman of economics and various things. So, I tend to think that way. But there are sometimes some, public administrators sometimes that don't quite see it in a quantitative measurement kind of approach. And I think that this is really something that you want to pay attention to. So those were the things that overall they thought was important. Now let's talk just in a little more detail about them, and I'll try to move through here fairly quickly. One is, when you talk about preparing a community adequately, and hopefully you've got copies of the slides, and I also gave you or handed out what we call an action plan matrix. And the action plan matrix is a chance for you to make a little note and say, here's something I could do, here's some people that could work with me on it, here's some things we might be able to use as benchmarks. And I would encourage you to take notes and just take it home, think about it a little bit after you've had some time, and see whether or not there's a role, an active role, that you can play in Transform Rockford. So I just had forgotten to mention that earlier. So in terms of adequately preparing communities, you need to have the entire community involved. You need broad-based representation. Networks are important. In these days, it's no longer really a top-down kind of situation where West clocks many, many years ago made the entire clock. The new watches are probably made by 50 different suppliers. So it's a network. And the next day, after the watch is made, the same suppliers are networking with somebody else to make something else. So we're really talking about networks, and networks come and go. Every one of you is probably in 10 networks. It may be a club, it may be an office, it may be a church, it may be all kinds of places. But you have got the power to leverage those networks. And if you get involved in Transform Rockford and you take on a committee or be a part of a committee, you can call up your neighbor who's a network, or you can call up your church member who's a network, or you can call up somebody else and say, hey, would you like to work on this? Now that takes the initial group of Transform Rockford people into thousands. And so this is really, really important. So keep networks in mind, and networks and partnerships for sure. You have to have local ownership. And I think you're getting that with the visioning programs, and I think you're going to get it from what I know about these strategies. So that'll be good. Leadership capacity has to be enhanced. And this is really important because in the situation we're in now, with some of the baby boomers who have been leaders moving on, we've got to bring on a pretty large new group of leaders. That's going to mean that for those people, particularly minorities, particularly people new to the community, this may be their first leadership experience. You can't afford it not to be a good one. So essentially, you've got to reward those leaders, you've got to bolster them up, you've got to bring them in. They're going to be the future of Transform Rockford in 10 years, in 7 years, whatever it turns out to be. You've got to have it. So there's just no question about it. You have to anticipate, you have to create the anticipation. I'm going to talk several times about changing the conversation. And I think this is particularly important in Rockford because a lot of the things we've talked about when I was doing economic development and other issues is that for whatever reason, over a lot of years, Rockford has had kind of a conversation or an impression of being an older, rundown, manufacturing, blah, 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 blah. And in fact, I don't think the aerospace, the health, all these kinds of things has yet risen to the level of conversation that the old 1932 manufacturing kind of scenario was. So changing that conversation is terribly important. And I think that's something that will be key as you work with Transform Rockford. And the newspapers here, the news media is here. I mean, this is crucial and a very important part of what you do. So I think you really want to do that. You got a good story to tell. You want to be sure you tell it. Second thing that was important was preparing high-quality programs. And some of these I want to just go through very quickly because they kind of touch on other things. But you need to understand the difference between the program of Transform Rockford, this big program, the process, the visions, the strategies, and these kinds of things, and the product. The product is a better educated group, more social capital, better leadership, these kinds of things. And you have to keep those separate. You have to know that as you're moving through the process, which is going to take most of your work, you need to understand that this is really the key part. So the old saying that it's the journey rather than the end, and that's really what this is. The process is the journey. So if you go through Transform Rockford for, let's say, a year or two, and it stopped for whatever reason, Rockford would be better because it went through the process, it traveled the journey. People are going to react differently. You're going to be building human capital, social capital, political capital from day one. But understand that. That's the process. It isn't necessarily whether there is or isn't a Transform Rockford. And it isn't so much even the final product. It's really the fact that you're going to change people and the way they do things. And you're going to change them, pretty soon. So that's an important issue. The other kind of things that were important are things that probably you would have thought anyhow. But the idea of having a program that's based on a solid literature. There needs to be science between what you're doing, or behind what you're doing. And by science, I don't mean science in a sense of hard sciences, but I mean science that's been tested. These concepts have been tried elsewhere. They're found to work, or we know that something's true about them, but they're based on fact. You make decisions based on fact. Fact is typically based on data. So you collect the information, you visit the cities, you bring it back, you analyze it, test it against whatever criteria you can, then it becomes science or becomes addition to the literature. And that's, I think, terribly important. The new paradigms and thinkings, that kind of goes without saying. You want to build on practices. breakthrough mentality is something that's been picking up a lot of steam in Arkansas. And the theory on this, and I think there's some good science being developed here, is the idea is you don't think small. And you didn't go back to Burnham and said, make no small plans, and these kinds of things. But there probably ought to be several really big things in a Transform Rockford vision. Something that really make people say, wow, I don't know if we can ever get there or not, but let's try. And if you try to incrementally do it, it probably isn't going to get noticed. And this was part of the Valparaiso Promise program. So we're going to send every kid to college or something like that. Probably never happened, but in fact, it was big. And there's a lot of these things around that you can do. So think a little bit about what could you do, and maybe it's a slogan that Rockford picks up, and the kind of things that you can do. So put that on your list of things to think about. Flexibility is required. You want professional respect. And I think you're doing it right in the sense that you're making Transform Rockford events major event. I was at Coronado Theater, 1,200 people, give or take. So, I mean, that's a pretty big event, right? So if you can do these kinds of things periodically, it really causes the conversation to change. Hey, this thing, I think it's going to work. The train has left the station. Maybe I ought to get on. It's that kind of a philosophy that you want to create. And you can do it. You can do it honestly, openly, the news media, everybody else. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. Delivering the programs effectively. Here, kind of we go back to some of the other things we talked about. You're really talking about partnerships and networks are terribly important. You have to set goals and expected outcomes. And I would say that some of those goals ought to be lofty. Some of them you're probably never going to reach and probably never want to reach. But it's the idea that you have motivated people to think bigger and make them try or have them try. And when you think about goals, you might have 7 goals in Transform Rockford. But I would submit that you have 1,000 goals, because every participant in Transform Rockford has now got a set of goals. My kid's going to graduate from something, or my person is going to do this. So you have all these goals that actually are coming together. So even though there's only 7 of them, or 8 of them, whatever, on your sheet that you're publicizing, every person that participates and goes through this process has his or her own set of goals, or hopefully. And that's really what you want to have happen. So I think this is really, really important. Also recognize the indirect effects and the outcomes. I was working with a group in New Hampshire, and in one of my books, they wrote an article on New Hampshire's been working on a similar kind of program, smaller program with cities for a better part of maybe 15 years. And what they have found in their research is that it isn't so much the big how many jobs do we create or how much investment did we get. The things that people valued most were the indirect things. Namely, they now had contacts, better networks, they had a social capital, they could call somebody and get something done. The community just worked better. And that was really one of the things that they considered maybe as good or better than how many jobs did they create. So, don't lose sight of that. And I think it's important. The program identity is important, and you're doing that fine. You're communicating on Facebook, all these kind of things. This is terribly important, especially for the younger generation, because they may not as much read newspapers anymore. They may or may not, listen to other kind of media. But in fact, they're certainly on the computers. So you need to kind of think a little bit about that. You want to always have the meetings so that the people actually enjoy what they're doing, so it's a pleasant experience. Tonight excluded, but basically, but most of your events need to be exciting and enjoyable. Always stick to your mission, your program mission. There's a lot of times as you're moving through, and we have found this as we looked at other groups, a new fad comes up, a new crisis comes up, all of a sudden we put something on our side and we work on the next thing, and sometimes never come back. Always stay to your mission, always stay on target, and this is really important. Another thing that's kind of important that's growing more science now as well, and that's the concept that you can, in this kind of a setting, you may be able to convince people that they don't have to ask to do something. You get people think, I have a good idea, but I'm sure the bank wouldn't do this, or I've got this idea, but there probably is a rule against it, or something like this. If you can cross the bridge to where they don't feel they have to ask, they try it. Now, sometimes they say it's easier to apologize than to ask permission or something like that. I'm not suggesting that you go quite that far, But I do think there's something to the idea that you can have people build enough confidence to where they say, hey, this is an idea, I've thought about this, I'm going to grab a couple of friends and do it. Tap their network, you might be surprised at how many of these things are going to happen. So I think these are the kind of outcomes that if Transform Rockford is successful, you can achieve. Another thing that's growing some science at the moment, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, there's not a whole lot of research in it yet, but it seems to be having some effect, and that's having a community coach. Namely, communities that are working through these kinds of programs have an external person, not full-time or anything like that, but a person who comes in every now and then and does a reality check. You know, they've got some experience on something, or maybe it's several coaches, but they come in and sit down and say, well, you know, you might do this. I mean, there are several levels of coaches, and we can talk about this, but I think this is something, we're seeing some research in North Dakota, a lot of research in Arkansas, that's really suggesting that this is probably something that future visioning programs are going to actually build in, just this person or persons to do this. Okay, the last thing is persistent follow-up. And in this particular case, it's, again, nothing really different than I think what you probably would have done anyhow. But you're really talking about maintaining accountability. And I think this is terribly important. As I mentioned earlier, I would expect this group to do metrics for sure. You want to document outcomes. You want to grab the low-hanging fruit. You want quick successes. And I'm a very big believer in low-hanging fruit, what we call sometimes the itsy-bitsy projects, namely things that you know you can do them right away, they make a good impression, people get, hey, you know, this group's kind of working. And so these are the kind of things that are important, rather than waiting for the really big thing that's going to happen 2 years from now. So think a bit about that. The long-term sustainability. Whatever you do, you need to be building the roots so that it continue long after, you know, we're gone. Communicating with social media, I think this is terribly important, especially for the younger generation, and we talked about this before. Always focus on the future. There's a great tendency sometimes when you get into visioning sessions or you get into other kind of programs, well, you know, this isn't going to work here, or we tried this before, it just didn't work. So you get that sort of a negative kind of approach. You need to keep looking at where's the future, where are you headed, and stay on target. I think that's really important, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. I wanted to share with just a few minutes with you about a program or some research that the Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. Excuse me, I'm going to blow my nose here. The Federal Reserve Bank wanted to look at a group of cities that were heavy industrial cities in 1960, actually. They had 20% of their employment in manufacturing, and the cities were at least 50,000 population. And they were basically, the cities actually had come back. So they were trying to figure out what kind of mechanism was happening in the cities that actually was bringing this about. So they grouped the cities into 3 or 4 categories. And the categories were really on how far along were the cities coming back. So they had sort of hit rocks, if you would, or rough times, and then they were moving back, and they were all moving back, but some of them had moved back faster. And they called these cities some of them were resurgent industrial type cities, some of them were transforming cities, and transforming is not anything directly related to Transform Rockford. But the idea was the cities that were resurgent actually hadn't fallen as fast as the other cities, and their social capital or their quality of life hadn't dropped as much. So they really hadn't gone down as far, but they were coming back more quickly. Then you had the transforming cities that had fallen farther back, had fallen lower, and they were coming back as well, but it was basically they were coming back a little more slowly. And what I wanted to just talk with you a little bit about was some of the key findings that they had. Now, when the bank looked at the research, and they did a lot of interviews with these communities on site, a lot of them were in the Midwest, and within Illinois, Aurora and Joliet, I think, were 2 of them that were included. But the thing that they found that these cities were really focusing on, and they're on your sheet, but the workforce development and skills mismatch was at the top of the list. Well, that's really what's high on the list, in Transform Rockford, is how to find new skills, how to develop the workforce. Second thing was that they were thinking regionally and globally. And I would suggest that RAEDC and other groups are doing exactly their thing. They're thinking about foreign direct investment, all these kinds of things. What are our relationships, bringing in trade missions, these kinds of things. A third thing is the economic development and finance. Is there money in town so that people that want to start businesses can do so with a reasonable prospect of success? And this I don't know enough about Rockford for, but do you have capital at all different levels? Large firms, middle-sized firms. Does the infrastructure have capital? Can you get capital? Are your taxes sufficient? The fourth thing was, do they have an effective leadership? And let's just talk about these for a couple of minutes. The next slide. When you look under the workforce development programs, these were some of the specific things that they found common in the cities that they worked with. And it was raising school completion rates, certification programs, online training, including overseas or older workers as well as youth in the programs. And the older, mature workers are really, as you looked at the first numbers I had, they are going to be part of your workforce that you're going to need. So I think the fact that a person turns retirement age, you may need to talk to them a little bit more about doing other things, staying on, whatever it is, because they're going to be pretty essential for the next few years. So don't forget them. You're really looking at lost my place here. We had active engagement by employers in designing the services. And this is really important. What I'm seeing now as we're looking in other places is that the businesses are at the table, mainly because they have to be. They need these workers. And they are, in some cases, unable to fill pretty good paying jobs. And there's a big debate raging now about is it that we don't have enough skills or people available, or is it that we're just not paying enough? But I think the businesses will make a pretty good case. They're paying some pretty darn good salaries and aren't able to get the people with the kind of skills that they feel they have to have. So that's kind of important. The flexible responses in terms of meeting employers' needs was important. And then changing the conversation about manufacturing. And this was true in most of the cities. And I keep coming back to that. But manufacturing is very different than it was when my grandfather did it in whenever, 1950 or 1940. It's a totally different environment. And I don't think we've caught up with that yet. And I think there's a message here that we really have to work with. And I think that Transform Rockford can play a significant role in that process. So think a little bit about that. Second thing that was we talked about was a regional, if not a global mindset. And here we're talking really about global markets. We're talking about regionalism, not thinking about just Rockford or thinking about Boone County versus Winnebago County. We're thinking about probably 20 counties because they're feeding Rockford or Rockford's feeding them in a sense of supplies, these kinds of things. I would submit, and I'd confer with what Bert said last time, you ought to be thinking about Chicago. I mean, Chicago's 90 miles away. And for a person who's 35 years old, 90 miles is not very far away. And living in a place closer to Rockford, it doesn't have to be in Rockford, living to a place out here and working out here, but spending weekends or other times, nights, whatever, in Chicago, I think is a pretty attractive thing. So think broadly, think regionally, if not globally. The government service delivery, this is something sometimes that can get in the way. There may be a lot of governments, there may be competing governments, there may be a good deal of confusion about who's doing what. Most of the cities that were resurging had taken a look at that, and you may want to as well. The idea of building civic pride, and again, this is partly changing the conversation, but this is a part of wearing a lapel pin saying that you're glad that people will ask you about Rockford. I mean, you wear a lapel pin so people say, oh, you're from there, huh? So tell me about it. That's the kind of people you want who are doing that kind of stuff so they can say, hey, let me tell you about Rockford. Here's what's going on. And that's the pride that you're trying to build. The second one that we wanted to look at was development finance. See, this next slide, I guess. And a third one, I'm sorry. In this particular case, we're really looking at how do we leverage the variety of financing tools that you need to do. And You have an excellent asset in the Iger Lab in terms of the kind of things that Dan Cataldi and others are doing with respect to starting businesses, these kinds of expansions. So this is clearly an asset that can be used to help particularly younger people coming in or people new starting businesses. So that's terribly important. You have to have money for large capital projects, neighborhood development. The Eden project that I mentioned earlier, I think is really doing well in trying to bring the neighborhoods together in businesses and these types of activities. The philanthropic investment. Think a little bit about, are there some people who are willing to invest in Rockford in a big time way? And we talked about transfer of wealth. I would submit before they invest, they want to be convinced and have confidence that transformed Rockford is going to make some difference. So I think this is something that doesn't happen the first day. I think it happens as you go along, and more people learn what it's about, like it more and more, and come to work. They had different kind of resources for municipal services. You could provide services in a lot of different ways, but the big point was the services were good. Then finally, the engaged and visionary leadership. And here you had leadership, really collaborative leadership from public and private sector both. And I think this is what you're really building in Transform Rockford, in the sense that the people, the elected leaders are in fact showing up at meetings. They are saying nice things. They're not at the point yet where they necessarily have to deliver. But, that may come to pass. But the idea is they're on board. And I think that's what's really, really important. The transparency, you're certainly doing that. You have to gain a consensus on issues. You're certainly doing that with the visioning program. And you're building the next generation of leaders. I haven't seen that yet in just a little bit I've looked at, but my guess is going to happen. And I don't see why it won't. So that's something, though, to kind of keep an eye on. And some of the folks in our panel can maybe talk to that a little bit. Okay, so we get to implementation. Now I'm going to jump a slide in some of your handouts. But essentially, what we found in talking with the 12 leaders that had done all these programs, effective communications seemed to be the big thing, that you have to be in constant contact with your clientele. And this is something that I see no reason why Transform Rockford won't do. We mentioned earlier the new leaders, the people who are untried, the people who may fail the first time out, the people you can't afford to lose. So there's got to be a safety net for those new leaders, or they won't step up again. And these may be leaders who traditionally have never been to a council meeting or have never taken a leadership role. They may be younger, they may be new to the community, they may be homemakers, people who just traditionally haven't played this role. So think about how you bring them in, encourage them, and make it work. The broad base that we talked about of participants, evaluating progress, we talked about a little bit. Need to have a well-known adjustment process if an option doesn't work. There are going to be some things you try, and should be, some things you try that are really entrepreneurial, and they bomb. So what's the adjustment process? How do you bring it back? How do you make them work? And does everybody know how? And I think that's be something that you're going to work at. I talked about community coaches as a possibility. To document and celebrate successes. Let me just spend just a minute now on community coaching, because I mentioned this earlier, and I think that it's something that you're not going to read a lot about it. I don't think there's anything about it in my book. Actually, that came out 2 or 3 years ago, or there's very little. But what the coaching concept is that an external person spends a bit of time in the community at strategic times and sort of says, let's step back a few minutes and let's see, is this going in a direction that you want it to? And an external person can ask tough questions, harder questions that you yourself, if you're embroiled in the process, can ask. And that person goes home at the end of the night or the week or however long they're there. So they can play that role. They can help you overcome challenges. They can identify maybe some political obstacles. If they know the business, they can say, well, I know of a place that tried something like this. Here's how they could have avoided it, something like that. And I think it's useful. They can improve communications, resolve conflicts, help build relationships, identify internal, external resources. They can help respond to changes. So they're just kind of a Johnny on the spot, and they're not very expensive, but they can be a sounding board. There's been some research conducted now as to whether or not it's better to have a designated coach inside it who lives in a community and more familiar, or someone who lives outside, less familiar, but maybe more impartial. And so I think there's more yet to come on that. Okay, getting down now to what I listed the common ingredients for, items to monitor. Let's look at that. What kind of things are you going to watch as you go through the implementation? I think one of the difficulties, probably the biggest difficulty that we spotted when we talked with the community leaders, the ones that were doing these programs, was maintaining momentum. And that's the idea. Everybody's excited the first year, maybe the second year. Jobs change, people leave, interests change. So 3 or 4 years out, it's the second or the third group that's trying to maintain, transform Rockford. That's the tough part. So how to somehow build in some ways to make that momentum happen. And I think that one of the earliest and easiest and best ways to do it is to get ownership, to buy ownership right away. Serving on a committee, having a network being formed so you're responsible, making it fun, making it so that it's not another job. These are the kind of things that I think are what keep people with the programs. And I'm sure that a lot of thought's been given to this. That credibility is terribly important, and we talked about that several times. Building trust and an openness so it's not, well, I know the person who's doing this, and he or she has this hidden agenda. You've got to basically get past that. So there has to be a trust that we're in it for the common good. Each of us is going to get our goal accomplished in some way, or we're going to be better off, or our kids are going to be better off, or our grandkids are going to be better off. So I think that, these are the kind of things that are important. New leaders, we've talked about the new initiatives and buy-in, avoiding the latest fad, trying to stay on topic. I like a continuous improvement process in some way. It doesn't have to be really big and cumbersome, but there need to be checks. You need to know, are in fact we getting better? And how? And if not, why? So those kinds of things have to happen, and they need to happen probably at several different levels, and I think they can. Celebrating successes, and this is something that I think is really important. Maybe it's an annual event that you have, just the first anniversary, the second anniversary, or maybe you have a party. Somebody really scored well on one of your initiatives, so you call people together. Maybe it's events like you're doing here, that you're saying, well, gee, something happened, let's get together and talk about why it happened, and reward the people who did. I think this is really, really important, and something that you want to do. Okay, so kind of wrapping this up, some of the common ingredients for success. I think as I look back on this, in both the work that I've done and also the research and stuff that we've done, I think an asset-based community development is really a very important approach. You have to make the case, and you make the case by talking about how bad everything is. And frankly, when I left the Coronado Theater, I wasn't real eager to come back to Rockford. I mean that partly in jest, but there were a lot of, we're lowest in this, we're lowest in that. Now, the case had to be made, and I don't think it was the wrong thing to do. I think that case had to be made. But it wasn't the kind of thing that said, well, I'm going to go see a real estate agency and see if I can't move to Rockford. So I think now that you've made the case, people are on board, you have a shared vision, or you're getting a shared vision, people want to move ahead. Now you start talking about what are our assets, what are the good things, what are the positive things about Rockford, the Rockford area. I keep saying Rockford, but I mean Rockford area. What are the positive things about the Rockford area that we can build on, and that we can celebrate, and that we can make come to our aid? And I think that's really important. The Coordinated Business Workforce Program, there are a number of excellent things going on, some funded by federal government, Rock Valley College and others are really working well. So you've got a really good program going on there. The system, at least, I did a little bit of work with Rockford Rocks, or at least talked to them a couple of times. It seemed to me that this is the direction that a year or two ago they were trying to move, and I think my thought is that this is probably something that clearly is going to be a real asset for you. Opportunities to attract high or younger adults. This is something to give some thought to. I don't know Rockford area well enough to know whether that's the case or not. But Rockford area probably can't compete with Austin city limits. But maybe there's some lessons in Austin city limits or maybe some things to think about what they're doing, the types of things they're doing that maybe could be done in Rockford. I mean, great bands go wherever they're paid. A lot of places have band shells or auditoriums or places to entertain. You do have a young professionals organization. I mean, maybe things like that need to be developed more. But I think that's really important. You know, that first or second slide that we talked about, those are the folks that you're going to really want to cater to come here. And I think one of the assets you have is the Chicago area. Namely, I think they could live here, have fun in Chicago, come back home at night, and it would be a real asset. So to kind of think a little bit about that. The other thing we talked about was the regional versus global. We talked about that. The development finance opportunities, visionary leadership, quality of life for targeted audiences. I think all of these we've kind of touched on before. But I think the other thing would be, and just to kind of repeat a little bit, that you think about a breakthrough agenda. Think about not just can we make it to the next step, but can we jump 2 or 3 steps? And I wouldn't go so far out that you embarrass yourself, but I would go to the point to where it's a bit of a stretch, and people start to think differently, and see what happens. That pretty much sums up what I was going to talk about, and we wanted to have some discussion with the panel. So you probably have guessed I'm pretty positive about the Rockford area. I'm pretty positive about Transform Rockford, and I think, you know, based on the kind of experiences that I've had, never having run a program like this, but the kind of experiences I've seen, I really think you've got an awfully good start. So I thank you very much for coming, and appreciate it.
Good evening, everyone. I did have a quick question. We obviously were co-leads on the process team, and you've said a lot of things here tonight that, and in reading your book, that struck chords with me personally, being an HR professional, developing leaders, succession planning, changing a culture basically of a region, which is a much larger scale. One thing that I think we did, and it wasn't mentioned, which is why I want to ask your opinion on this, is we started with creating some shared visions. Shared values, I should say. And we use those, and I know in our meetings, every single meeting, we start off with our meeting and we put that up on the board and we discuss them a little bit. And so I don't know that that was a common theme that you've seen in other studies, but it's something that I think has been very beneficial for us. And I've been able to personally just internalize those values and say, I'm okay with what's on here. I can live with it, and I can abide by this, and I can assist the process. So I'm just wondering if you've encountered other scenarios where they've started out with creating a shared value system in trying to transform their culture.
I think they've done it in many instances, I believe, but I don't know that they've done it to the extent that you've done here, as openly as you've done here. And I think that's good. But I think the difference is a lot of the communities that we looked at and that the programs that were being run were in really much smaller towns. So you talk about an area of approaching 200,000 or 170-some thousand. I mean, this is a pretty large place, and a place that has probably a more diverse culture and a more diverse set of groups, kind of organized groups within it. So I think it was probably more important that you do it in the Rockford area than it might have done if we did it, say, in DeKalb or something like that. So I think it's, so, you know, I'm with you. I think it is important, and I think, and I saw what you did in the first meeting at the Coronado Theater. I thought, you know, these kinds of things were laid out and where you were headed. And I think what that does is builds transparency. I mean, here's what we're about. Here's what we're trying to do. Hopefully you can agree. You know, it's hard to find somebody who couldn't agree with those kinds of shared values. So, so I think if there was a question there, I think it's very positive.
Dr. Walser, first of all, thank you very much for being here and sharing. We really appreciate it. One of the thoughts I heard and read also, that this concept of a community coach is very intriguing. In your comments, you hinted that perhaps that's a hired professional type person. I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether that could be another community volunteer type person. We've seen folks that have stepped into leadership roles on our teams, have facilitated the vision process, and while these are new skills in an event of this scale, could you see those type of folks being those community coaches throughout this process?
Yeah, I think.
Fix the process.
Okay. We just, improve the process. I think it can. Again, there's not a whole lot of science yet on the coaches, who they should be, how they should work, various things. But there's really 3 levels of coaches. There's one level that just kind of comes and helps you organize, gets you going, keeps you on target, these kinds of things. There's another level of coach that actually sort of challenges you. It starts to look at, maybe some research. Well, I know that they did this over here, or did it over here, or this maybe would work. But really goes a step beyond just kind of attending meeting, encouraging, attaboy, these kinds of things. And then the third level of coach really comes in and says, is this really the destination you want to be? I mean, you've been doing this for 2 years now. How about thinking about going here rather than the current path that you're on? And that, that probably takes a different kind of person. I think there's also the literature that I'm beginning to read. I don't think it has to be one coach. I think it could be different coaches. But the characteristics, I think the coach has to be trusted, that it just there's no axe to grind. And if they're living in a community, that may be a little more difficult because, I remember that person when he or she did this. See, you've also got that baggage. So if you can find a person highly respected, fairly knowledgeable, these kinds of things, willing to kind of study up and work with you, I don't see why it couldn't be from within a community. And again, it's some of the stuff I read from in North Dakota, where they were working with a number of these groups, they actually found that somebody living in the community probably had some more effect, wasn't a lot more, but probably had more effect than somebody coming in from the outside, simply because they had credibility. So that's probably a long answer to your question, but I would even think about multiple coaches. I mean, they're not a full-time job. They don't get paid thousands and thousands of dollars to do this. But many times they're just volunteers. But it's the idea that they may be can do especially well on this issue compared to this issue, something like that. So.
This is more a process question. I know you've heard our presentations, Coronado, and talking to us, several discussions. Our process is 6 steps. It's fairly simple. Are there any steps that maybe we should consider taking a deep dive in, or maybe even adding a step or moving something around, adjusting our process?
Might be good just to list the steps for the audience.
Sure. So the first one was obviously the establishing the case for change. The second step is where we're at now, and the vision creation portion, and we're getting ready to move into the strategy portion, then the implementation, and the 5th step, remind me, Scott?
Check and adjust. Right?
Check and adjust to our metrics. That's, again, a little bit further out. And then 6 is reevaluating, making sure that we're, what adjustments do we need to make at that point in time. So it's a 6-step process.
And pretty much this is what I was hoping would happen, in the sense that when I was driving up here, I was thinking, what's the best thing that could happen from this meeting? And oddly enough, it was probably that these guys would say, there's nothing new here. We're doing all this. Because basically then they've passed a reality check. They're doing the kind of stuff that the conventional folks that are doing this stuff for a living are doing. So, and I think we're doing it. I think you're basically saying the things that you listed, the kind of things that I had reported on, I think essentially are in congruence. I think what you'll see next, you've done the visioning. I think what will happen is a blurring between the strategy development and the implementation, because you're going to have some strategies that are pretty clear. We ought to be doing this, and you'll start doing them. Well, you've moved then from strategy development into implementation. And then there will be some other strategies that are going to take a little longer to develop, and maybe be more controversial, and you may have to work through some roadblocks. And so I think it won't be necessarily as cut and dried as, okay, we started the visioning, we're now done, or we made the case, we're now done. I think it'll be more of a mosaic or some, fuzzy lines. And that may be where it becomes a little more difficult to manage, because sometimes people get impatient, and you say, okay, now, I told you my vision last week, I don't see anything different this week. You get that kind of a mentality. And well, there's the strategy development, there's the implementation. Implementation to get results, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. And sometimes you may never really see the result. It's just that all of a sudden you find out that your graduating class, a higher percentage of them went to Harvard. Well, that was maybe 10 years later. But it wasn't necessarily a goal, it wasn't necessarily your strategy, but the system worked. And all of a sudden you have these nice benefits. So I think that, I guess what I would do, given that I sort of like low-hanging fruit, I'd be inclined to move into your quicker strategies, have action on the ground, at the same time that you're working on your other strategies. And you want to make sure that they're not in conflict. But I would basically work on strategies and implementation at the same time and move ahead. So it's not a real good answer to your question, but I think it's, what I would really say is don't wait until one is done and then you move to the other. When we're talking about this now, I mentioned up there that I think one of the bigger difficulties is how do you maintain the momentum? And have you guys given any thought to things within your implementation strategies or visioning or things that you're actually building this group of people that are going to really want to stay after the first year or after maybe their goal has been met or something like that? Just any thoughts about that?
It's a great question. We've discussed it actually quite a bit because we are looking ahead into some of the other steps, and burnout is a question that we've been discussing. And so what are those celebrations, those wins, and can continue to keep folks engaged in the process, but as you mentioned earlier, keep looking for folks in the community that are willing to be a part of the process, not just the process team, but the overall process, to be a part of different teams, and we'll be able to establish some succession planning in that regard. So if I should step down for a period of time, someone else can easily slide in, take over, and keep the ball rolling.
And I think, that concept of coaches fits right in with that process as well, as we can say, here's somebody that can continue to challenge the teams as those dynamics change in terms of participants. I think what you talked about in terms of early wins, celebrating successes are critical. Everybody gets excited when something good happens, and we can all rally around that. There's some concepts that get discussed. One of them is called strategic doing. We're in a process where we're talking about building a vision, identifying those gaps, building a strategic plan towards that. You talked a moment ago about identifying quicker wins, et cetera. Can you talk more about what is strategic doing, and is it one of those things or another, and compare and contrast them?
Strategic doing was actually most recently brought out by Ed Morrison at Purdue. And it was kind of in a little bit of frustration to a lot of the strategic planning processes that really when you go through, and strategic planning is great, and strategic doing is strategic planning, but it's a different form. But it's the idea that in a strategic plan, if it's in a private organization, you have, let's say, a president and a series of vice presidents, and the president really has the power to say to the vice president, within 6 months, here's where we're going to go. And so the system is there, the people have an incentive, they move ahead. That doesn't work so well in a university, in a public agency, in a city, because people aren't necessarily all on the payroll. And so what basically happens is, how do you develop a network arrangement? So strategic doing is really building networks, and it's essentially saying, how can we work together? So you start out with some sort of a vision, which you've got. Where you kind of move away from the strategic planning element of it is when you get into strategic doing, you ask 3 or 4 questions. The first one is, what could we do together? So we've got this vision. Now, what are some things that we all could do and basically reach this vision? And in doing that, what I'm saying is, well, I think we could do this, but I'm also saying, I've got this network out here. And I can bring that network to the table. And so I can do my part. And Angel or others can say, well, I've got my network over here, and I can come as well. So it's that combination of networks is what we could do together. So we could do a lot of things together. Now, we can't do them all. So then we come back and we say, okay, what makes the most sense? How could we narrow down these 200 things we could do to, let's say, 100 of them that really make a lot of sense to do? And we willow it down, looking at our resources, looking at the time we have and various things, and looking at our networks, and looking at our assets. And by assets, I don't necessarily mean financial. I mean your contacts, your past experiences, various things. If I was working, for example, with Transform Rockford, and we were doing strategic doing kind of process, and I came to the table and said, I think we ought to, try to build new industry or something like that, or attract industry, then I would say, well, my network is in research. So I could bring to the table the ability to crunch numbers, to analyze stuff, these kinds of things. So those are my assets. Doesn't cost me any money necessarily, but it's things that I do. And so Angel might say something else, or Scott might say something else. So strategic doing is what could we do? Let's get down to what makes the most sense, or what should we do? Then narrow it even further to what will we do. At that point, each of us sitting at the table is saying, okay, I'm a part of this team. Here's what I'll do. And here's what my networks will do to help me, or here's what I can bring to the table. So then it isn't like, well, what is that group over there? What are we going to plan for them to do? We are the group. And it's pretty much what are we going to do? And the final question is, let's meet in 30 days and figure out what did we do? What have we done in 30 days? What are we going to do in the next 30 days? The next 30 days? What it is that kind of a process? It doesn't have to be 30 days, but it's the idea that we've decided this is what we could, should, and will do. We have the networks and the resources, the assets to make it happen, and we'll commit for the next period of time to accomplish these things. And when you meet the next time, you start out with, what did we get done, and why? So it's that process. So it's not something that's, I don't think, revolutionary. I think it's just a different take, but it's more so, it isn't so much sitting around the table saying, let's figure out something for somebody else to do, which is kind of what sometimes is in a strategic plan. The upper management sort of decides what everybody's going to do. Strategic doing is more the idea of what are we going to do together, and what assets can we bring to our table, and what do our networks look like, and let's get a timetable to do it. Kind of a long response.
I don't know if we want to maybe take some questions from the audience, if anyone has one. You too.
In the Industrial Cities Initiative, under the themes that mentioned skills mismatch, I found that interesting. Was it really a gap in skills, or was it more that the workforce was finding places that were better suited to their talents? I was just curious if that skills mismatch is something to consider.
Yeah, the question was in the Industrial Cities Initiative, when we talked about mismatch between skills, was it really the adaptive skills, or was it that, if I understand your question, that people actually had left to go elsewhere to do other work? That's kind of what you were saying?
Well, basically, was it just that the skills were present, or that people were changing industries more based on their interests?
Oh, okay. Were the skills actually present, or were people changing industries? The reports that I've read, I don't think are in enough depth to do that. If you want to Google the Industrial Cities Initiative in the Federal Bank of Chicago, there's a big report coming out. It's in draft now. Probably within a month it'll be released. And the early papers are relatively short. So I don't know if they get that far, but that deep. But I think what we have found in the other skills mismatch idea, there's two things happening, several things happening. One is that the skill set is changing. And you're talking about advanced manufacturing techniques, and we're talking about the kind of machines and techniques that require a whole lot different, let's say math preparation, other things, than maybe 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So you get into the interesting question of a person who has worked faithfully in a job and has had good reviews for 20 years, for somehow is displaced because the company left town, can't get rehired by the new company essentially making the same product because they're using higher level techniques. The machines now are much more complicated. It takes trigonometry, to be able to program them, all these kinds of things that 2 generations ago, the machines didn't require. So you have that kind of a skills mismatch. You have very capable people later in life, I mean, not real old, but they're basically later in life, good quality workers displaced, but they're having a heck of a time getting back in. And that's why the certification process has really, I think, gained so much power, because the employer is not necessarily convinced that that someone has a college degree or even a community college degree. It's a question of, can they do certain tasks? So I think where we're headed in workforce is to have people take shorter programs and stackable credentials so that I can get a credential or a certificate that I can do this. So it's a documentation. The employer says, okay, I can do this. I can't do a lot of other things, but I can do this. And then I get 2 or 3 of those. So now I've added up to where I'm an employee that's worthwhile to hire because I'm fairly specialized. Now it may be in 20 years, I'll be out of touch again. But I think this is how we're responding. And I think you're seeing a lot of this. I'm sure Rockford is doing this as well. I don't know enough about what Rock Valley College and some of them are doing. You're probably working on this, yeah. And you may want to speak to this. But I'm seeing it in a lot of more rural areas where even the workforce shortage is probably worse. And there's even, it's kind of interesting, one company that I'm very familiar with, they actually have credentials and certificate of employability and that concept in the company. So what happens is any employee that wants to go through a training program and test for the next job can actually do so and then go on the list to go on to the next level. So it's almost like within the company, they have stackable certificates that you're qualified for this, and then this, and then this. And I mean, it's an upward mobility chain, and the person doesn't have to go back to a community college or to a university. They're basically able to get the training on spot. But it's a fairly specialized type of training. So again, I'm kind of taking the microphone here.
I think we had a question.
Okay, yes. How to build next generation of leaders, right? Yeah. Well, this is important. I mean, there are a number of programs that in the past I think maybe were more prevalent than they are now. For example, Boy Scouts, and you've read some of the work about people. We don't have as much social capital and these kinds of things. People aren't involved in traditional organizations. But I was a former Boy Scout leader, and both my sons are Eagle Scouts. And in our troop, in our training program, we actually had leadership development. So we're talking about kids who are 10, 11 years old, who are patrol leaders, or senior patrol leaders, these kinds of things. And, I mean, they weren't prepared to go into industry at 14 years old. But the point is, they had the concept of leadership, responsibility. But enrollment in the Boy Scouts is down. 4-H had a great leadership program. But we don't have as much involvement in those kinds of programs. Now we have involvement in other places, and they're just as good as far as for the students, for the kids. But I don't think they focus quite as much on leadership. So I guess what my take on this would be, it might be good, depending, if you do an assessment of what you have in Rockford, transfer in Rockford, and if you talk to the young adults, and you talk to them about, would you have some interest in some sort of leadership role? And then you could provide some programs. A lot of communities will have a program, usually with the name of the community, something like, I don't want to use a word here, but say Advance City X, or something like that. And it's a monthly set of meetings where they have different people coming to the groups, talking about the community, talking about what's going on. They may have some professional leadership kind of people come in, do some coaching, these kinds of things. And they're pretty common around, and Rockford probably has them. But I think that's the kind of stuff that you can do at a very low level. At a more advanced level, I think is you give people opportunity, but you give them opportunity with a mentor. So when you have an opening, you try to recruit a younger person who has never been a leader before. Now that can cause a heart attack because you're saying somebody who's never done before, but you can pair them up, and you can bring somebody in, pair them up with somebody who maybe just wants to be a part-time, and essentially take them along. But I think, and also reward them. So that it works, they did a good job, you keep them going. There's nothing like success to cause people to want to come back. So in 30 words or less, that's basically what I would suggest. Okay? Any other questions?
So, most people in this room, I think, really do understand and value what this process is all about and why it's important. But what my concern is that at this stage, essentially we've created values, vision, and a mission. And a lot of people just don't buy into that because they've never seen it work well. Do you have any specific examples of communities that have used that sort of philosophy of establishing missions and visions and values and then successfully transitioned and communicated to everybody what the steps are?
I don't know if I can identify a city that had done exactly that. I think if you look at, well, even the community that had the Promise program in Michigan, what am I thinking of? Yeah, Kalamazoo. If you look at some of the steps that they went through early on, they were triggered from the outside. So it was a different kind of model. I mean, they had private wealth that actually got them going. But I think as they were working through the process, they were taking a bit of a step like that, trying to do something, come back, refine it, do it again. If I'm understanding your question properly. The other one that I kind of like, and you might take a look at, is Des Moines, Iowa. And it's not so much that they've done some superhuman thing, but the approach that they've taken. They've gone through like the community capitals, and they've identified the capitals as areas that they want to work on. So they are working on the build-up capital, or the human capital, or the social capital. And in that process, they're really creating a vision and shared values for each of those capitals. But when it all comes together, what they have is a pretty good community development system. And I think that's, that is a way that, at least I'm taken with it because, maybe because it's partly academic, but I'm taken with it because I think it's built on some sound thinking, some sound modeling, and it's something that isn't really all that hard to do. No, they had other kind of things. They had a downtown development, they had industrial development, they had natural resources, various things. But I think it was the idea that there's a framework that people can understand. And I would encourage, as you do the Transform Rockford, that you have this framework that a person on the street can identify with, and they can know that what you're doing over here actually matches up with what's over here. And I don't think it has to be a huge computer model, but I do think that it's really important that in fact these linkages are created, because people are going to have to network between these goals and between these areas that you're working in. And so I think that might be one response. Does that help or not? Okay, fine. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
Are you going to make a formal organization out of this? Subdivisions that are concentrated on
I'm sorry?
certain goals? I mean,
I'm not hearing your question.
Seems like it's unstructured here. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but
You mean to transform Rockford?
what is the future of this? I mean, are you going to get it like a business structure? Someone reports to someone that we're doing this and we're getting to this goal and setting up goals and having people, work towards those goals? Or
This is probably more a question for you guys to answer.
it seems like you got a bunch of people, and what are they going to do? Are we going to be organized here?
That's a great question. I don't know if everybody could hear that, but I think that the essence of the question is, will there be an organized structure to transform Rockford that would also include a set of goals and objectives and missions that would actually be accomplished? Did I hear that correctly?
Right.
Yeah, good. That's a question we talk about often, and we're all, as Angel hinted to, and Sharon said earlier, we're process geeks, but at the same time, we want to get there faster. We're all impatient. We want results now. We want things fixed now. But one of the other things we heard from Norm tonight was that there's never been an effort like this undertaken that he's aware of. of this magnitude. And based on the study and work and what I heard was some of the critical pieces that he's gotten from their studies of other community efforts and that he's encouraged by in the Transform Rockford effort is the inclusiveness of the effort, involving many, many, many people in the community, investing the time for those voices to be heard, to be able to craft a unified vision. And for those of us that want to just fix things now, that's difficult because we want to get started. But it's critical in making sure that we have a unified vision of where we're going. Now, the good news is the next step in this process, after the vision process, in which our vision drafting team is taking all this input, they're going to come back to the community, say, did we hear you correctly? We'll agree on a final vision. The next step is the strategy piece. And the volunteer teams are putting together what is that structure of people that will be involved, how will those teams be built, how will they support the goals and missions of actually accomplishing. And those will be made up of volunteers from the community as well. This isn't a business or another governmental unit. This is a community-driven event. And it will have a structure that is built up and supported by volunteers that will make that happen. And we'll hold ourselves accountable. Here's our goal. Did we make it? If we didn't make it because it was a bad plan or because we didn't work the plan, and what are we committed to make that change? Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, you're going to have a group that's ahead of all these other subgroups, right? And you want to have consensus on what are the goals and how are you going to accomplish it and all of that.
That's exactly right.
I mean, that's the structure of a business. I mean, they have goals and then they know how to get there, you know? You can't just say, read all this stuff out on paper and then, oh, that's fine, good. Now what?
That's right.
These people
That's
out
right.
here are wondering where are they going to do next, you know? Are they going to be here next time? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people, I was there the first time and there were probably more people there, but you know, how many people are going to come next time? I don't know. And then, what are these people, are they qualified in certain areas? I mean, you gotta have a committee how to get the best people on the right committees too.
That's exactly right. And there's a lot of our good teams here that are working on that tonight. In fact, Lorraine, I'm not sure where you're at, if you want to speak to engagement. I saw Lorraine earlier. And how we're getting the right people and finding those and getting them on the teams. Leadership development team. There is a structure to this that is being developed and rolled out. So those things that everybody's looking for and asking for to make these things happen are coming. And it's coming quickly. You'll see that within the next few weeks. So hang tight a little bit longer, but we'll be encouraged about your input about the structure when it rolls out, and we'd like to hear more from you.
I would just add a little bit to that is we've mentioned, you know, Kalamazoo, Valparaiso, Des Moines, Austin, I know we've talked about, but this is Rockford's. So I think the good thing about it is what worked for them worked for them. We're trying to discover what's going to work for us and be nimble enough to change courses if we have to. So I've been pleasantly surprised in the number of sessions that we've had and seeing some of the common themes that are popping up. So it seems to me that we have a lot more things in common than we do our differences. So I think we're going to be able to structure ourselves effectively, and when our vision eventually rolls out, that we'll be able to rally behind it and support it and do some of the things that Doc has been telling us here this evening that are be ours. They'll be ours, they'll be unique, and they're Rockford. So I just wanted to throw that out because my next question is for Dr. Walzer again. You mentioned in your book A Silent Citizen, I believe it was called. And I've lost count of how many visioning sessions we've had already. And again, some of the common themes that are popping up are pretty exciting. But from a process perspective, we've constantly asked ourselves, how many sessions do we need to have? What's the right amount? Structure, time frames, dates, and what other avenues can we potentially open up to make sure that we capture as much of the community input as possible. But I was wondering if you could talk to a little bit about that as far as, first of all, what exactly is that from your studies? And then do we need to be doing something different in regards to making sure that we don't have an overwhelmingly amount of invisible citizens?
That's a very tough question, and it's I think it depends upon how much diversity not in the race sense, but diversity in a sense of attitudes, ages, different kind of things, because you could never get everyone in the community's input. So in this essence, people of whatever color or anything else, we all come with different kind of perspectives. So if you were raised in the South or the West or the East, you come with a different attitude. Somehow, you have to feel confident that you have the majority or a substantial majority of the thinking in what you're doing. I mean, that's when you want to move ahead. And that's what a shared vision means. It doesn't mean unanimous vision. It means that you have a shared commitment, and there's enough that you can move ahead with. And hopefully you're not hurting anybody that hasn't been hurt. You can always adjust things as it goes along, but at some point, and I think what the gentleman just talked, that asked the question, at some point people become impatient. And that was one of the things that I noticed most, I think, when I was out working with cities in earlier years, was they never had time, or a lot of people never had time for the vision, but they wanted to get something done this afternoon or after we went home. The difficulty was they didn't know necessarily where they were going. So without that vision, and this can sometimes happen even with like strategic viewing. If there's not enough time spent on the vision, everybody gets active, everybody's doing things, everybody feels busy, but they're not sure exactly where they're going. So I think, it's not a good answer to your question, but it seems to me that when you feel like as though you've given people a fair chance to be heard, that want to be heard, and some people are never going to want to be heard. They're just not going to do it. And when you feel like as though it's converged, it's basically, honing in on something, it makes sense, and you presumably will send it back out to the people in some way, and you say, here's what we think we heard. Tell us if we're wrong. If you've gone through those kind of tests, I think you probably have buy-in. I think at that point you move ahead. And then if you have to tweak it a little bit later on, and that vision may change. It may change next year a little bit because you were successful this year or you weren't successful this year, and as a result, what you can do in the future will be seen as a little bit different. So it's a moving sort of thing. And I guess at some point, I think you'll find that the transformed Rockford, when it becomes endemic in a community, will become less and less visible. People will be, things will be working, people will be excited about what they're doing, they'll have their part of it. I mentioned earlier, you may have 1,000 goals, and everybody has his or her own goal. And so essentially when those goals start to get to be materialized, then it won't be so important that there's a central body doing this stuff, because it'll just kind of take off on its own. Okay. I had a question I wanted to ask. Is there anything, and you kind of alluded to it, I think, Angel, but is there anything thus far that has really surprised you, that you didn't expect? I mean, this was a big undertaking. You came into it, without a lot of experience with this kind of activity. Was there anything that you've really been most impressed or kind of surprised about?
For me personally, I think, again, as I mentioned earlier, the passion and the engagement during the community visioning sessions, and then some of the common themes. Coming into it, I did make a bit of an assumption that different sessions would come up with slightly different themes, but they're not. They're surprisingly very similar along the way. Education, infrastructure, jobs, safety, a good place to live, basically.
I feel the same. It's been really encouraging. If you've had the opportunity to go to a vision input session, it's really quite an experience. There are a couple more on the calendar, so get there quickly. People are excited about the community. They have the same ideas of what it means to be a great community. And I come out of every one of those just re-energized and excited about what we're trying to accomplish. And that's been very, very pleasantly surprising and enjoyable.
We got a question over here.
One other thing that I've heard that was a surprise is that there's people in the community saying, for the first time ever, they've been asked for their input on how to make Rockford a better place next to it.
So a comment that for the first time ever, a lot of folks in the community are saying that for the first time ever, they're asking me for my input and giving me the opportunity to present it. Well, if there's no other questions, I'll turn them. Oh, I'm sorry. I guess we have one more.
I'll be brief. Speaking for the younger generation, one thing that I definitely agree with is the leadership. There's not a lot of people with leadership qualities, a lot of leadership training. I'm huge on personal development, and that stuff is done with me personally. It's just really puts your mind in a different place. I think a lot of the younger generation don't do that, don't know about it. So being able to touch on that. Besides that, what this gentleman was talking about, the goals, and how we can get there, I think if the why of everybody collectively is big enough, the how will get figured out. And, finally, a question for you as far as all the other communities you work with, the issue of health and how that affects every facet of life, our economy, our workforce, and that Rockford has recently been the fourth most obese city in the nation. Do you agree that's an issue?
I'm sorry, Rockford was the what?
Fourth most obese city in the nation.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true or not, or whether it's a fact or not. Bert said last time that the rating things can be kind of difficult to work with. I guess I'd have to look at the numbers, and I'd have to see what this actually means. As I look ahead with the aging of the population and the fact that you've got a pretty major health institution here, agency here, I was kind of considering that an asset. Now, there may be some reasons why people aren't taking advantage of it. So if what you've said is accurate, that in fact it is relatively heavy, then the question, I think, or the thing that Rockford would want to do is to address the why. Namely, why is it that people aren't either taking advantage of it? Is it that they didn't have insurance or whatever? Is it some other aspect that makes it what the cause is? But to me, it's you look at these things and you say, well, we're the worst of this or the worst of that. To me, what that suggests is it's an issue to solve. So I think that's an agenda item. So you say, okay, so we don't worry about it. We simply solve it. And so you go in and you say, okay, what are 3 things we could do to try to address that issue? It may take several years, but I think it's something that, if there is a good thing on ratings, I think it's probably on the negative side, in the sense that if you're rated poorly, it's good motivation. If you're rated number 1, you probably don't do anything. You just enjoy it. You write it to all your relatives and all that kind of stuff. But I think when you're rated below, it's when it really triggers you to action. And that's how I would approach it. And so I think that's an excellent point. And I like your idea about the leadership. I had not really thought of Transform Rockford itself as being a leadership development program. But I don't see why it couldn't be. I would think you could get a cadre of young people interested and basically bring them in and deliberately have them take leadership roles.
Absolutely. I'd like to follow up. By the way, I'm Mike Shablaski, Executive Director with Transform Rockford. There have been some excellent questions. I want to comment on a few of those, and then we'll wrap things up. But I would suggest maybe even what's more important than what Norm's or Angel's or Scott's thoughts are regarding health. It's what the community has been saying in the visioning sessions. And you can look online, but it is frequently coming up. And that's part of why people need to participate in this, is to have their voices heard on these sorts of issues. But it's frequently coming up. And it does come up, especially if you ask yourself, would a great community be unhealthy? I think we know the answer on that. The other thing I want to challenge ourselves, I heard a couple comments here tonight about getting young people involved, including the challenge from Norm in our community, but also why not in Transform Rockford. So I don't know if any of the team leads want to take any comment on that, but I would certainly suggest that we should be looking for opportunities. We do not have to wait years down the road to get young people involved in things. They can get involved and transform Rockford today. And if you're here and you want to, at any age, whether young at heart or on your driver's license, please, you can see me or one of the people that are involved with this. We would love to have you in this effort, and I think it's going to make us better for it. Then, I don't know, Scott or Angel, you want to add anything to that?
I would just echo the same thing, is we need more people engaged in the doing. As Norm mentioned earlier, we're getting through the easy part of it. The heavy lifting hasn't even started yet, so we're going to need, whether young at heart or otherwise, but everybody, all hands on deck, and so come forward, tell us, and we will find a spot for you to help us out.
Please. Okay. Then, I guess to move toward the closing, I really want to thank a lot of people. Obviously, Norm, Angel, and Scott for putting this on tonight, and for speaking tonight, and Dr. Head and Sharon for their comments. I hope what we took away from this was that, some confirmation of a few of our fundamental principles and we operate on. But I hope also, if you were listening, that we were challenged and called out on a few things, and we've got some things to think about. And I look forward to that, and working with everybody, including the community at large, on addressing that. I thank Rockford University for hosting us tonight and the teams that put this together, especially Bridget French and Scott Saporiti on the community dialogue team, and Leslie Cooper and Christy Jarrett and the communications team for getting the word out about this. And there's a lot of other people that are doing a lot of great work already. And I look forward to hearing what Jim Keeling and John Holmstrom look to line up for the next speaker and forum for us in this learning series. Lastly, I want to get back to the point of, so where are we going? Where's the stuff? I think next month is going to be an exciting month. I would ask that all of you that are curious, it's going to be an interesting month. The goal is going to be established, I hope, by the end of April. And I would invite every one of you to stop down. Last visioning session for us is Monday evening at Rock Valley. If you haven't, please come out. It's the best way to participate. It's at 6 p.m. But if you cannot make it, or if you're looking at this on YouTube and you're out of town or just not able to make it down there, please participate online. You can at transformrockford.org. You can let your voice be heard there. Please do that. And then immediately after that, on Tuesday, you will see us starting to set up shop at the Coronado Corner, at the corner of Main and Park in Rockford. Please show up down there. It's going to be rather transparent, literally kind of transparent, because it's a storefront where good people will be trying to take all this information from these visioning sessions. We've had, through the dozens of events we've had over 4,500 people engaging. We've heard over 2,000 particular voices through the visioning process. And now we've got to distill that down, and it starts next week. And I look forward to seeing all of you. Come on down, see what's going on, and that it's good people of this community that are trying to put this together. And it will be offered up for your consideration, your review, your comment. I'm sure you won't be shy, and you'll let us know what you think. But I hope that by the end of April, you'll see something that you recognize and see yourself in, and something that you want to go after. So thank you very much for coming out, all of you, and we'll see you in April. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Nice job, guys.